after the absolute atrocities that were Game of Thrones season 7 and 8, I vowed to never anything Game of Thrones television-wise ever again. It even took me a couple years to finally get back into reading the books. And trust me, I own every single book out there, including the graphic novels and the mini novellas inside compilation books. Now, House of the Dragon was announced, and I wasn't enthusiastic because it was only a year and a half after season 8 ended that it was announced. But I kept up to date with the news and everything, and I told myself if I was going to watch this, I might as well review it. And if I were to do both of those, or even just either of those, I might as well wait until the entire season is finished and then binge all of it all at once, because that's honestly how seasons are supposed to be watched. Not entirely full series, but at least seasons are supposed to be binged the whole way through, straight through. That's why the one thing I liked about Netflix is when they release TV series, they release an entire season all at once, and I do appreciate that from Netflix. HBO doesn't exactly do that still. They still do weekly episodes. Now, House of the Dragon premiered, I think it was August 21st, and concluded with its season finale just last night. Now, as stated, I own all of the books, every single compilation, every single book known to Game of Thrones history. I originally wanted to read the entire Fire and Blood book before watching the show, and I just remembered that there's a mini novella called The Rogue Prince inside of the Rogues compilation book that is about Daemon Targaryen, which I did read that mini excerpt years ago when I first bought that book alongside Dangerous Women. Now, with that being said, unfortunately, I couldn't finish Fire and Blood, and I didn't get to the stories of House of the Dragon Season 1. And honestly, that's the first thing that is kind of a letdown for the House of the Dragon Season 1. Literally, in a 700-page book, they drop you off in Season 1 at the very start, literally in the middle of the freaking book that it's supposed to be based on. Now, from everything that I've read, as far as comparing book to show, it's mostly accurate. And that's great. My biggest gripe and issue with House of the Dragon Season 1, it's not even about the show itself. It's more of just the writers not focusing from very beginning to very end. Instead, they just give you Season 1, call it something of Targaryen lineage, House of the Dragon, and then instead of telling you the entire story through a televised series, they just drop you off and plant you right in the middle of a freaking storyline and just say, hey, here are middling characters of this entire giant lineage of a family. And that was a bit of a letdown before I even got into watching House of the Dragon. But besides that, getting into my review for House of the Dragon now. So to start, I will say the best thing about House of the Dragon is that it basically wipes away all the sour taste in our mouths that we got from Game of Thrones End. The last 2 seasons were complete garbage. House of the Dragon brings Game of Thrones back to its glory and its heyday, and honestly, it is a great return to form. And with that being said, House of the Dragon is actually a lot more about politicking and politics than it is sex or anything, even less violence, honestly. House of the Dragon is purely political. It is a purely political story about the lineage of the Targaryen family. And everybody wants to have a certain rise to power in any way, shape, or form. And I do really like that aspect about House of the Dragon. Visually, this show is remarkable. It looks fantastic. Although there are some inconsistencies in the visuals, but 95% of the time, House of the Dragon looks like a banger. It is almost pitch perfect. My gripe with the inconsistencies are more so having to do with they got lazy and used CGI instead of practical effects. Like when there's an elk or a deer or something that you can definitely use a real being for practical effects, they just splashed in CGI and it is very, very noticeable. And that's the weird thing. The times when they use CGI, when they could have used practical effects, those are the only times that you can tell that it's CGI. The dragons, the dragon fire, even the environments, the settings, everybody's costumes, everything that is CGI other than like deer and everything looks remarkable. Everything looks pitch perfect except just those specific things that they definitely could have used a real life animal or being or something for practical effects. That's where it's a little inconsistent, and it's a little baffling and confusing because they had the option, obviously. Say, a tied up elk. They could have brought in a deer or an elk or something and just tied rope around its legs and it would have actually looked realistic. Instead, we got what appears to be basically a comparison, like if you were to compare Gollum in The Hobbit to how they made Gollum in The Lord of the Rings, you can very clearly tell that they used pure CGI for Gollum in The Hobbit over Lord of the Rings, which was practical effects, mostly. Story-wise, what we get in the story is fantastic. Like I said, this is purely political. This is nothing but intrigue in politics and who gets to be Lord, Prince, and King. That is where Game of Thrones always shined, and House of the Dragon shines a little brighter in certain spots when it comes to this than Game of Thrones ever did. Now, another inconsistency with House of the Dragon lies in its story. Not so much its story, which the story we get is remarkable. It's the fact that they don't even try to flesh anything out. Instead, they take 5 or 6 full-length chapters from Fire and Blood and try to sprinkle them all into one season, which if you've read Fire and Blood, the majority of the chapters are like 75 plus pages long each. So think back to Game of Thrones, where Game of Thrones, one episode would be roughly 80 to 100 pages worth of story in a book. And then a whole season of Game of Thrones is a whole book. House of the Dragon, they, for some reason, try and stretch a quarter of Fire and Blood into one whole season. And even then, it feels like they're really lacking for story in the sense of its storytelling and plot devices. There are so many fucking time jumps. I hated that so much. We go through 19 years worth of story inside of 10 hour-long episodes, and it feels disjointed. It's like the first 3 episodes, basically straight through, but then you get a 6-month time jump, and then a couple episodes later, you get a 10-year time jump, and then after that, they don't even explain it. You have to research it then. Then they go on like 2 or 3 year time jumps every other episode, and it ultimately ends up being 19 years total that you're going through, which is fine. Honestly, if they centered the story for the entire series around in that whole 19-year period, that would have worked well. But they wanted to cram so much story into one freaking season, and the story itself is fine. The storytelling of it bombs. It's not terrible. It's just such a letdown because it feels so disjointed. It doesn't feel consistently paced. It doesn't feel rushed. It just feels like they're trying to just get to the point instead of making the point. Acting, everybody does a solid and very well done job. This is HBO. Expect that. Paddy Considine, not entirely sure how to say his name, to be honest, as King Viserion, he kills it. Same as Matt Smith as the Rogue Prince Daemon Targaryen. He kills it. Now, as far as the characters in this series, the thing about Game of Thrones is that the story was centered around every single person trying to one-up everybody else so that they got their place in the Regency and kingship. But in between all of those shitty characters, we had the POV characters that were very sympathetic, very likable, very relatable. House of the Dragon, King Viserys, or Viserion, I forget what I just said, but played by Paddy Considine, which, because of his acting, his character was actually very likable and very relatable. And everybody's acting was fine. The problem, though, is outside of that one character, all the other characters are shitty characters. They're shitty to themselves. They're shitty to everybody else. They're not very relatable. They're not really likable. Look, Daemon Targaryen, badass. Nobody can dispute that. Matt Smith, he kills it in that. But just because you're a badass character does not mean you're a likable or a relatable character. Again, Daemon Targaryen, he is a shitty character. Even Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen can sometimes be a spoiled, shitty character, even when they're full-grown adults. And honestly, that's where the biggest problem with House of the Dragon lies too. It's that this tries so desperately to cling to staying with the feeling and the vibe of Game of Thrones that by the end of season 1, it feels too much alike Game of Thrones. Honestly, 8 episodes in, I was halfway through the 8th episode, and yet another thing happened at yet another event that always happened and took place in that event in Game of Thrones, and I was just like, wow, didn't expect that. Oh, yes I did. And honestly, I could go on, but the main points have basically been pointed out already. And like I said at the beginning of this review, I really wish I could have gone into season 1 as expected with reading the entire book. But I'm about 3 or 4 chapters before this season's story because, well, everybody can relate to this. Life just hit me. And I just ran out of time and I stopped reading for a while. But as a viewer that loves everything Game of Thrones, I really enjoy House of the Dragon Season 1, although there are some pretty bad errors and mistakes that they made in Season 1. And it has nothing to do with adaptation from book to TV. Honestly, if they had stuck to a complete adaptation from the source material, I think they would have done perfectly fine. But because they tried to do their own spin and their own devices for storytelling, they fucked it up, kind of. It's still a really good show, but overall, I have to give House of the Dragon Season 1 a 7 out of 10. It's really enjoyable. I really enjoyed all of the political aspects to it, and they barely have any sex scenes in it, which is fine because, I mean, this is literally just about politics now, so honestly, I feel anybody could watch this show, whereas Game of Thrones, really only adults could watch that because it was either violence, backstabbing, or graphic sex scenes. At least House of the Dragon, even when there's violence, it's graphic, but it's definitely not consistent. The only consistent thing about House of the Dragon is the political aspect of it. So, overall for me, House of the Dragon Season 1, 7 out of 10. Thank you.